Welcome to our interactive webinar series entitled We Are All Part of One Another. My name is Paul Magno. I direct the Aiyar project for Nonviolence International, and I'm grateful to be offered the opportunity to host this morning. I'm a plowshares activist myself, a veteran of inaction in the 1980s, for which I spent almost 2 years in prison. I'm speaking from my home at Jonah House in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm excited to host this webinar with our good friends from the Kings Bay Plowshares Action. We'll discuss what they've done and what they face, and with all of you from who are gathered from many corners of the world. And I look forward to this morning's discussion. As we wait for people to join, as people are coming in and dribbling in here, I wonder if we can take a minute to do a couple of things. On the assumption that everyone knows how to use their technology, I want to ask us take a moment to be silent and to remember all those who are suffering from various pestilence and threats, including COVID, which preoccupies us these days, including the nuclear arms race, which threatens us always, including climate change, which is wreaks havoc all over the world and invariably lands on the poorest and most vulnerable people. Those pandemics and the other threats and burdens that people live under in the world, let's take a moment to commemorate and offer our hearts and our prayers to them. Thank you very much. I think we'll be bringing everybody else in gradually here. I'm counting on Connor to do the technical magic here because I don't know anything like that. As you get people aboard and we get a large circle, let's see if we can do a universal hello to each other and make some joyous noise for a moment.
Hello, Hello. From the Des Moines Catholic Workshop.
Hello.
From Sri Lanka.
Mary Martin for and Louis
From
Vitale
India.
from Francisco.
Kolavenu from India.
From Sri Lanka.
Canada.
Louis sends his love. He can't be here, but he sends his love.
Des Moines Catholic Workers.
Nick Weber from Oklahoma City.
Friends who love you from San Francisco.
I'm seeing wonderful, wonderful messages from all kinds of wonderful places. I think about every continent is represented, so that's wonderful. That's great. Good morning, everyone, and once again, welcome to our webinar today titled Global Resistance to Nuclear Weapons in War. My name is Paul Magno. I direct the Aiyar project for Nonviolence International. Have been involved in the plowshares movement over the years. I will serve as your host today. As we get started, I want to thank all of you for joining us from all over the world, and especially our 5 guests, Martha Hennessy, Alyn Ware, Divina Maloum, Shankar Aiyar, and Patrick O Neill. I also want to thank the staff of Nonviolence International, Michael and David and Connor, who are helping out behind the scenes with the aspects of this broadcast. For those that are new, Nonviolence International is a backbone organization of the nonviolence movement, providing fiscal sponsorships and to partners all over the globe. We tell the transformative stories of emerging nonviolence movements that give us hope in difficult times and reshaping what we view as possible in the world. The webinar series we're part of today is called We Are All Part of One Another. This is a line from the great feminist nonviolence activist Farmer Deming. That line originated, I believe, in the 70s and is, of course, reflective of an even more ancient truth that lies at the heart of all world religions and of scientific understanding of humanity as intensely social and interdependent beings. COVID-19 is, I'd better not promote it, is exposing the truth about our mutual destiny and our mutual susceptibility. It also reveals the injustice and misguided policies in our world and the way its effects land on people. COVID is sweeping the world and causing much sickness, death, and economic hardship, particularly for those who are elderly and marginalized and in poor communities. Mutual security is never going to be found through nuclear weapons. To seize this moment of opportunity, we need to change our way of thinking. The purpose of this call is to inspire us to redouble our efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons and to change how people think and how institutions behave. We want people over profit, human security over national security. We want an immediate end to civil wars. We want transparency in public affairs, whether financial security or public health. We want a world based on international law, and we want massive changes in resource allocation to reflect these values. And that's our starting agenda. Nonviolent responses through mass collective and institutional action are needed. We need sustained nonviolent campaigns that shift and elevate public opinion, that shift power away from corporations and authoritarian regimes, that move resources to life-affirming and stable security for all humanity and for the earth itself. We want draft resistance, war tax resistance, peace education in schools, nonviolent direct action, peace constitutions, and the abolition of nuclear weapons. How do we get there? Today we have guests from 4 continents who are extraordinary peace activists. Each will speak for about 7 minutes and will speak in the order in which I introduced them. We're going to be listening for 35 minutes, and then we're going to have 45 minutes of questions and discussions among us. We'll finally have a concluding remarks by Nonviolence International's founder, Mubarak Awad. Martha is the 7th grandchild of Dorothy Day and divides her time between her family farm in Vermont and the Mary House Catholic worker in New York City. At 64, she's a retired occupational therapist and grandmother of 8. She has been imprisoned for protesting war and nuclear power and nuclear weapons, the use of drones and torture in Guantanamo. She's traveled to Russia, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Korea, and Palestine, among other places, and to understand the effects of United States military policy and war in other countries. Martha travels and speaks on the topics of life and work in the community, Catholic social teaching, nuclear abolition, and peacemaking in the tradition of the Catholic worker movement. Like Patrick, she's a defendant in the Kings Bay Plowshares facing sentencing at the end of May. Martha, welcome.
Thank you all so much for having me. Can you hear me? Okay. Sorry to not have Patrick introduce at first the action that we did, but I'm going to focus on just giving a little education and background on the Catholic worker. The purpose of Dorothy Day and Peter Marin's efforts was to really address the injustices of secular industrial society in America. And Dorothy also witnessed over the decades of her life, a social and economic system that failed the ideals of democracy and Christian goodwill. And she has much to offer our present moment, marked by economic inequality, ecological destruction, war, and a church in need of hope. With the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Dorothy wrote an article in the paper. She was a journalist. They had a paper called The Catholic Worker. And she wrote in September of 1945 an article about the outrage of having dropped the bomb. And she was very much a lone Catholic voice in this outrage and opposition. And she touched upon the whole concept of the mystical body, of we are all one of another. I want to talk a little bit about the aims and means of the worker, and then I'll move on. The vision is this: we are working for a new heaven and a new earth wherein justice dwells. We are trying to say with action, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We are working for a Christian social order. I don't mean to couch this completely in Christianity, because we very clearly see how we have failed ourselves on multiple levels. My approach has saved me. My faith is what guides me, in community with my co-workers, my fellow workers, and it sustains me when life looks so difficult. I do live in the belly of the beast. The US has been committing war crimes prior to my birth in 1955. I see a great militarization of society. I see it in what's happening to my grandchildren and the culture that we give to our children. I do want to say that there was great hope in the 1980s. Mikhail Gorbachev had offered disarmament, complete abolition of weapons. nuclear weapons. And this was turned down by Reagan because the corporate interests got to him. And we have this vision of absolutely dominating the globe. We have the war budget, which is eating us alive. And we have these proposals for a whole new class of submarines, the Columbia class. The amount of money going into this project is astronomical. We now want 30 billion of investment into this weapons system. We can indict the military industrial complex. We can indict particular corporations, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Lockheed Martin. You know, they are raping the globe and holding us all hostage. And it's very much time to make a change with this. I'm very hopeful with the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The countries need to sign on to that. And I just want to end with a little bit of a tip of my hat to Pope Francis, where he is directing us, you know, from the Vatican for the, you know, very clearly for the first time in decades, the use of nuclear weapons is immoral, which is why it must be added to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Not only their use, but also possessing them, because an accident of the madness of some government leader, one person's madness can destroy humanity. I also want to just simply say that we walked onto that base, you know, I'm a small person. I'm a very vulnerable person. I have put my fragile, aging body up against the US military, the most demonic, powerful element on earth. And I was stripped of defense. All 7 of us were stripped of any kind of meaningful defense in the trial. But we go on, we continue. And we did try to carry people of color with us onto the base with Martin Luther King's reference to the evil triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism. And please, let's remember Steve Kelly, who has been sitting in prison for 2 years now. It's a county jail. It's not meant for long-term holding. And he is the saint and martyr amongst us at this time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martha. Patrick O Neill is a journalist of almost 40 years and enjoys writing about religion, track and field, running, and politics. He's co-founded the Father Charlie Mahone Catholic Worker House in Garner, North Carolina in 1991. He's a hitchhiker and dumpster diver extraordinaire, has served significant time in prison for nonviolent protests, and is facing sentencing, as is Martha Hennessy, one of our other guests, for the Kings Bay Plowshares action undertaken 2 years ago in Georgia to confront Trident submarine. And Patrick, occurs to me that you might sketch out what the Kings Bay action, Plowshares action was.
The 7 of us went to a submarine base in South Georgia where slavery was defended by the Civil War. A lot of the values that people have still are distinctly inclined in that direction. It's the most conservative part of the United States. In 35 years that the Kings Bay Naval Station hosted Trident submarines with Trident II D5 missiles, there had never been an incursion on the base, never anything where people actually went inside the base. So they weren't expecting intruders, obviously. It was very simple to get in there. We cut one lock and went in on a gate, and we were able to gain access, 3 of us, Father Steve Kelly, Carmen Trotta, and Elizabeth McAllister, the widow of Philip Berrigan, were able to go to the area where the weapons were stored. There were these nuclear bunkers. Martha and myself and Mark and Claire Grady, and Mark Colville from Connecticut, Claire Shemitica, went to a missile shrine. That's what we named it. It was actually where the Navy had erected statues of nuclear weapons. In case, Trident II D5 is the most insidious, horrific weapon ever built by humankind. The Trident system represents the end of the human experiment. If those weapons are used, our world will cease to exist as we know it. And so they actually had statues, erected statues of weapons of mass destruction. It was surrounded by flags and kind of a little a shrine that you could go to look at these things and ooh and ah at them. So that's what it's become. It's become this adoration of nuclearism, adoration of weapons of mass destruction. Those who went to the bunkers were able to cut a couple of fences and get very close to the bunkers before they were caught by the United States Marines. The four of us who went to an administration building and to a missile shrine waited for well more than an hour to be arrested. We wrote with spray paint the word idol on the various statues. I tried to hammer on the statue of the Trident II D5, but it was made of solid cement and the head of my hammer broke right off. I also threw blood on the insignia of the Kings Bay base. We were tried in October, convicted of destruction of government property, conspiracy, trespassing, and also a second charge, which was called depredating government property. Depredate means to plunder, to lay to waste, or to prey upon. So these three felonies and misdemeanor added up to 20 years and 6 months of possible sentencing. Of course, we're not looking at anything close to that, but we are looking at sentences in the range of 2 years when we get sentenced on May 28th and May 29th, provided the sentences go forward. I think one of the things that we realized going down to the Deep South, what we didn't realize, was that there was really a love affair going on with the bomb in the Deep South. And unfortunately, I think it may be a global love affair that we have with weapons of mass destruction. I think what the United States government is telling its citizens is the same thing that all of the nuclear nations tell their citizens. Don't worry, mutually assured destruction assures us that these weapons will not be used. So just let it be in our hands. Let the Pentagon take charge of this. You have nothing to worry about. Well, of course, this basically says also don't worry about the displacement of the trillions of dollars that have been spent on warfare and nuclear weapons that are a theft from those who hunger, from the poor, from the environmental destruction that accompanies that. The government is basically saying that nuclear weapons are just props and will go on in perpetuity without ever using them. And there's really no moral issue here except that we're keeping the peace. People have bought into this argument from the government that nuclear weapons keep us safe. So when we went into the Kings Bay Naval Station, 7 pacifists accepted responsibility for our actions, got arrested, tried, and were going to prison. We tried to bring with us the message that these weapons of mass destruction have no right to exist. They're immoral, and that they threaten life as we know it on the planet. I don't know how many people heard that message. I mean, I think that we can't go into this with any real assessment of the efficacy of what we do. We go into it because we're following what we believe to be the will of the Prince of Peace. We believe that weapons of mass destruction have no right to exist. We kind of likened our actions, or I kind of did in my statement in court, to the Boston Tea Party, where property rights were violated of the British Tea Company, to make an important point. And also when Jesus cleansed the temple of the money changers and violated people's property rights for violating the holiness and sacredness of the temple. So we see our actions sort of in that light. We violated the property rights of people who have built weapons that have no right to exist. And we would use the example of if German Jews had tried to destroy the crematoria during World War II, would that have been considered a violent act or even a wrong act? The crematoria had no right to exist. Nuclear weapons are just mobile crematoria, which deliver the weapon, the crematoria to the victim. Plowshares have gone on, as Paul mentioned. He and I were involved in a plowshare action in Florida, not too far away, in 1984, and we served 2 years in prison then for that. Keeping the plowshare actions alive and hopefully going into different communities where these weapons haven't been challenged was the reason that we did it. And we try to keep raising this issue in different parts of the United States. People have bought into nuclearism. Phil Berrigan and my co-defendant Liz McAllister talked about nuclearism as a religion. People worship the weapons. And that's why we wrote Idle Law, because indeed that's what they were. You know, when we were in jail, a local priest from this town where the Trident base is in St. Mary, Georgia, visited us. And at the end of the, we had a Eucharistic prayer together and received the Blessed Sacrament. And after it was over, he said, "Well, you folks have been giving me some trouble at my parish. People don't understand how 7 Catholics can break into the base and destroy government property and say they're doing it in the name of God, in the name of Jesus." He said, "I don't know what to tell them." So he listened to us for 30 minutes, and in 30 minutes he got it. He understood us politically and theologically. But the question that I have is, how can a priest, seminary-trained priest, who can look out the window of his rectory and see Trident submarines floating by, never consider that the entire economy and the livelihood of this community in St. Mary, Georgia, and many surrounding places is based on death. It's based on the end of the human experiment, the end of life as we know it. And it never occurred to them, and it didn't occur to any of our jurors either. And it doesn't seem to occur to anybody. So we bring a message that people haven't heard before, and we hope that they listen to that message. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Patrick. We've had some powerful testimony to the purpose and intent of the Kings Bay Plowshares action from Martha and Patrick. And I want to turn to some of our partners across the globe, perhaps react to that and to share their work. First, we would like to ask Divina Maloum from the Cameroon, a young person working in civil society there. Five years ago, we started an organization called Children for Peace, a children and girl-led movement working across Cameroon in complex cultural systems for children's rights, gender equality, and peace building. She works with regional and international organizations such as the African Network of Young Leaders for Peace and Sustainable Development and the Kids' Right Foundation, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation, Unfold Zero, Abolition 2000, and Move the Nuclear Money Movement for Peacebuilding, Disarmament, and Disinvestment in Nuclear Weapons. She is the co-winner of the 2019 International Children Peace Prize, along with the well-known Greta Thunberg from Scandinavia. Divina, welcome.
Okay, thank you for giving me the floor. I first of all like to thank the Almighty in the webinar entitled Global Resistance to Nuclear Weapons and War. The plan of the presentation goes as follows. A continent challenged by security crisis and COVID-19 outbreak, Children for Peace engagement to address the COVID-19 impacts, networking, integrated community, nonviolent resilient initiative, ceasefire and nuclear disarmament. A continent challenged by security crisis with COVID-19 outbreak in Cameroon. Security crisis and their impact in Africa. Here are some images of the security crisis in several countries across Africa. The sociopolitical context in Africa is characterized by an escalation of violence and insecurity perpetrated by terrorist groups like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and the various affiliations of Al-Qaeda. Among my countries in the grip of multiple conflicts by select and anti-Balaka groups, Boko Haram in the northern part of the country, and crisis specifically in north and southwest of Cameroon. The main causes of violent extremism and terrorism in Africa and Cameroon. There are many reasons for violent extremism in Africa and Cameroon, like socioeconomic marginalization, literacy rates, and vulnerability in areas affected by war. Impacts of the security crisis in Africa. There are some images showing several victims of conflict by terrorists in villages and towns, among which there are 2 images. The first image illustrates girls abducted by terrorist groups and forced to be their wives for horrendous purposes. The second illustrates girls abducted during the Anglophone crisis. This is a picture of a girl recruited by terrorist group in the far north of Cameroon as a suicide bomber. Heavy material and human damages, that is the impact on the human rights. In Cameroon, Boko Haram has so far made at least 2,500 killed, 250,000 displaced. The war with the separatists has so far made over 3,000 killings and forced many, like 700,000 people fleeing across the border into Nigeria. Socioeconomic impact. According to the Interpatronal Group of Cameroon, in July 2018, the Anglophone crisis has already resulted in the loss of 269 billion CFA, destroyed 6,434 jobs, and threatened 8,000 other jobs. Impact on the democratic processes, like low rate of citizen participation in municipal, senatorial, presidential elections in the affected areas by conflict because of the fear of attacks. Impact on children. There are many impacts we have caused on children, like the drastic decrease of school enrollment rate, increase of early marriages, and many others. COVID-19 outbreak and its impact in Africa. Change in the environment due to human activities, from land use changes to changes climate as main causes, and spread of zoonotic diseases and pandemic of coronavirus from animals to human beings. Here is an image who illustrates the transmission of zoonosis diseases from animals to humans. Implication and impact of COVID-19 in Africa. African Union member states reporting COVID-19 cases, deaths, and recoveries by regions. COVID-19 has plunged the economy into a recession with the potential deep consequences and the historic level of unemployment and deprivation. Children for Peace engagement to address the COVID-19 in Africa through networking, integrated communities, driven pandemic mitigation, ceasefire, nuclear disarmament. The context and aim of the creation of Children for Peace. Here we will see the Children March for Peace and Human Rights on our campaign called United for Peace. Children-led movement working across Cameroon, created in 2015, which aim is to help children and teenagers understand peace building and human rights challenges. Our actions for global ceasefire and against coronavirus pandemic. We mobilize children and teenagers from complex cultural and religious backgrounds and affected areas by war to define and implement action plans and several local and nationwide activities. We organize children capacity building workshops. This too is an image of social lives and girls and children in conflictual and host communities. Here we are organizing a mass sensitization and capacity building of children in human rights, gender equity, and conflict resolutions. Here is an image of children and inter-community peace camps in affected areas by war with refugees and internally displaced people. We were building the capacity of girls in leadership for peace building, democracy, and human rights in some of our children peace clubs in communities. Here we're painting meaningful tools for education and advocacy on human rights promotion. We were leading children, including victims of war, in Art for Peace session to tell their stories and expectations through painting and drawing. Here we were having our campaign, Silence the Guns. We networked with several stakeholders and organizations to implement effective ways to synergical and durable address security crisis and contribute to the mitigation of impact through One Health and Eco Health for all. We have constituted a network with some religious and traditional leaders in several affected areas by war. Here are images of an advocacy meeting with several traditional and religious leaders to increase the collaboration with children and to resolve and end girls' rights violations. Here are images of advocacy with community leaders and local authorities to increase the participation of children and for more protection of girls' rights. We strengthen collaboration with regional and international organizations. The regional organizations, we work with them for the development of the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration technology for ex-child soldiers, the DDR Tech. There are some screenshots related to the DDR Tech software under development. Implementation of the project African Youth Resilient Initiative against COVID-19 and pandemic, which aim is to improve the capacity, knowledge of youth and children in the intersection of zoonotic diseases, pandemics, nature. So our aim is to improve life conditions, sustainable green growth, and health in African countries. We work to with national organizations as parliamentarians for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. There are some pictures of Meme's visit so far. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Divina. You've brought an entire important collection of issues to the fore here that I think we need to hear more about, and I'm grateful that you've brought them. I think they exemplify the struggles that go on in so many parts of the world that many of us, at least in the first world, don't always know enough to pay attention to. I want to turn attention to Mani Shankar Aiyar. Mani is a veteran of the Congress Party in India over a long career. He was born in Lahore before India was partitioned into two countries, and began his career in the Indian Foreign Service, serving in several stations, Brussels, Hanoi, Baghdad, and Karachi among them. From 1985 to 89, he served in the office of Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, where his enduring interest in the disarmament issues he'll be speaking to was much influenced by involvement in Prime Minister Gandhi's action plan for a nuclear weapons-free and nonviolent world order, which was presented at the United Nations in June of 1988. In 2010, he was invited to chair Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's group of experts on the continuing relevance of the Gandhi Action Plan. In addition to his work on nuclear disarmament, he was thrice elected to the lower house of parliament from Tamil Nadu, serving a term in the upper house as well, and served as a cabinet minister holding several different portfolios. In 2006, he was conferred the Outstanding Parliamentarian Award. He's published 8 books, including Pakistan Papers and Confessions of a Secular Fundamentalist. He founded in 1990 the Society for Secularism and serves as co-president of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Welcome, and please tell us what you want to share today.
Thank you very much. I'm really deeply honored to be among this group of activists who have done so much in their own personal lives to contribute to peace and nonviolence in the world. I was most impressed listening to Patrick and Martha and Divina, and I wish I could claim that I had been an equal activist, but all I have been is a civil servant and then a parliamentarian, attempting to push through democratic channels the idea of nuclear disarmament based on a philosophy of nonviolence. It was Martha who pointed out that in the 1980s, there was a brief window of hope when it seemed as if actual progress could be made towards nuclear disarmament. And availing of the fact that it was on the 9th of June, 1950, that Niels Bohr, the famous Danish scientist, had spoken in the United Nations General Assembly on the need to stop the further development of these wretched weapons, the nuclear weapons. Rajiv Gandhi chose the same date, the 9th of June, in 1988, to try to realize the objectives of the very first resolution that was ever passed by the UN General Assembly, which was sponsored by the United States and called for immediate nuclear disarmament. The failure to fulfill that very first resolution of the United Nations, which goes under the name of 1-1, that is the first resolution of the first General Assembly, has hampered the United Nations in much the same way as the failure to act on aggression in Manchuria by Japan and on Abyssinia, Ethiopia by Italy crippled the League of Nations. And that is why it remains extremely important that we use occasions like this and fora like this to remind the world of what it had itself promised to itself, namely nuclear disarmament leading to general disarmament. The action plan presented by Rajiv Gandhi in the UN on 9 June 1988 is now 32 years old. But in these 32 years, no other head of state or head of government has actually presented a practical, integrated path to achieving the goal of nuclear disarmament. That is the real sadness. Instead of sparking a debate on how we can get to this goal, the world remains stuck. I specifically refer to the conference on disarmament in Geneva on minor matters. We did get the CTBT, but then the US Congress failed to ratify it. And so we too refused to ratify it, saying that we will not be ever the only country in the world to stand against the implementation of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. But that means the US has to ratify what was its own initiative, and then we're quite ready to do the same. Equally, on the question of the Fissile Materials Cutoff Treaty, the Conference on Disarmament remains completely paralyzed because the US has been hoisted on its own petard by Pakistan, which has used a resolution passed many years earlier at the initiative of the US to only discuss those matters which are unanimously agreed upon by the CD, and by refusing to participate in the discussion, Pakistan has in effect stopped the entire disarmament process. And no imaginative ideas have come out. The world seems to be ready to just continue down the path where the 5 members of the UN Security Council, to whom the UN Charter had entrusted the security of the international order, became the only 5 countries who had nuclear weapons and used them both tactically and strategically, politically and militarily, to pursue their own ends and their own rivalries, one against the other. They pushed through the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, in the 1960s, which were nuclear weapon powers, were more or less excluded from the ambit of the NPT, while all those who did not have the technological capacity or the vision to see that they could acquire the technological capacity to make nuclear weapons were the non-nuclear weapon states that remained outside the treaty. There was a small group of mavericks, including India, which knew that it had to make the bomb and still had decided that it would be a nuclear weapon power, not a non-nuclear weapon power, but would be a threshold nuclear weapon power. And referring to this, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, in his speech at the United Nations in 1988, warned, and I quote, "We do not want to accumulate arms. We do not want to augment our capacity to kill, but the system, like a whirlpool, sucks us into its vortex. We are compelled to devote resources from development to defense to respond to the arsenals which are constructed as a sideshow to great power rivalry. Left to ourselves, we would not want to touch nuclear weapons, but with tactical considerations in the passing play of great power rivalry are allowed to take precedence over the imperatives of nuclear non-proliferation. with what leeway are we left? And the consequence of the world not answering that question in 1988 was that in 10 years later, in the same month with a gap of 3 weeks, India declared itself a nuclear weapon power de facto, because the existing nuclear weapon powers did not accept our de jure position. And within 3 weeks, Pakistan had declared itself a nuclear weapon power. And today, Pakistani missiles have been moved to within 50 miles of the India, which we have placed ourselves as individual countries, our region of South Asia, and the whole world, because the nuclear weapon powers under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty have taken no steps whatsoever in the last 50 years, 60 years, to move in the direction of capping, reversing, and eliminating their nuclear weapon arsenals. So Rajiv Gandhi presented an integrated plan where there were several links to the chain. These links included both the CTBT as well as the FCMO, but they were constituted a chain, the end objective of which had to be within a limited period and in a totally verifiable manner, the complete elimination of nuclear weapons from the arsenals of all countries that possess them, with a pledge from everybody else that would make the NPT a non-discriminatory treaty, a treaty between equals to not have these awful weapons of mass destruction. But Rajiv Gandhi went a step further. He said that you cannot have a nuclear weapons-free world unless it is based, unless it is founded, unless it is grounded in the principles of non-violence. That is why I am particularly pleased that we have Mr. Paul Magno heading our discussion today, because he represents Nonviolence International. Unfortunately, in my country, which gave birth to nonviolence under Ashoka the Great, under the Buddha, under Mahatma Gandhi, has more or less forgotten these principles of nonviolence. And we are now looking to an NGO in Washington to keep us on the right path. And so I would like to remind everyone, but above all, my own countrymen, that Rajiv said, when we eliminate nuclear weapons and reduce conventional forces to minimum defensive levels, the establishment of a non-violent world order is the only way of not relapsing into the irrationalities of the past. And he went on to quote Mahatma Gandhi, who said in the aftermath of the first use of nuclear weapons at Hiroshima, in the immediate aftermath, he said, the moral to be legitimately drawn from the supreme tragedy of the bomb is that it will not be destroyed by counter bombs, even as violence cannot be destroyed by counter violence. Mankind has to get out of violence only through non-violence. So that is why I have agreed to participate in this intercontinental discussion. It is as imperative today as it was in January 1946, when the UN passed its first disarmament resolution, as it was in 1950, when Niels Bohr warned against the dangers of nuclear war, as it was in 1988, when Rajiv Gandhi presented the only practical action plan with a path to total nuclear disarmament and anchored that new world order in nonviolence, that today, 32 years later, I continue to invoke the plan, I continue to invoke the man behind the plan, and to thank Nonviolence International for having seen the link between nuclear disarmament and nonviolence, both as the precursor to nuclear disarmament and the only way in which a nuclear-free world order can be maintained. This is a truly noble initiative. And although I am not an activist, I've never been sent to jail like Patrick has, like Martha has, like perhaps young Divina will be one of these days. I am much more in the intellectual sphere, in the political sphere, in the parliamentary and democracy sphere, working towards these ends. When I see these activists and when I see Michael Beer and Paul Magno doing what they're doing, I'm humbled, deeply humbled, and very grateful to all of you for having included me in this discussion. Jai Hind, which means victory to India, and Shanti, which means peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm especially grateful for your emphasis on the need to change the paradigm dramatically in order to have a peaceful, nonviolent world. We really have to rethink business as usual and find new ways forward. And rounding out our array of presenters today is Alyn Ware. Alyn is a New Zealand peace educator, campaigner in the areas of peace, nonviolence, nuclear abolition, international law, women's rights, children's rights, and the environment. Fairly comprehensive. He has served as the global coordinator for parliamentarians for nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament since it was established in 2002. His previous positions include director of Aiyar, Lawyers for Peace, executive director of the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, USA, director of the Peace Foundation Schools Outreach Program for the UN Decade for Culture of Peace, and founding director of the Mobile Peace Van. Alyn has won many awards, including the Right Livelihood Award. Alyn, can you take to the pulpit here and round out our presentations this morning?
Wonderful, and congratulations to Nonviolence International for having a online webinar that is bringing voices from America, from Africa, from Asia, and now with me, you do a double whammy. You get both the Pacific, because I'm originally from New Zealand, and Europe, which is where I'm living at the moment. This is a wonderful webinar to explore different aspects of nonviolence, and I really appreciate the previous speakers for touching on some of the topics. I'm going to be looking at nonviolence in the global sphere, international, some of the initiatives which are happening, particularly on the abolition of nuclear weapons and the abolition of war. And then I'll also be looking at what people can do in their own local areas. I'll try to minimize that so you can see a little better. So the key things I'm going to be looking at is nonviolence in international relations, picking up a lot on what Mani Shankar, Aiyar, was saying about the importance of nonviolence in an international world order. I'll then be looking at nuclear abolition in that from a couple of different aspects. One from what we did in New Zealand to reject nuclear deterrence, then what's happening in the global abolition movement, focusing a little bit on one of the key factors involved in the nuclear arms race, which is the corporations who are making a killing out of the production of nuclear weapons, and then the important role of parliamentarians. And finally, I'll circle back again to the abolition of war with a couple of initiatives which are happening at the moment to take forward the abolition of war. So I start off with nonviolence in international relations. And this is where I see that in the UN Charter, we already have a very strong commitment to nonviolence in international relations in the Charter itself. We see that in UN Charter Article 2, where there is an obligation for member states to resolve their international disputes by peaceful means and to refrain from the threat or use of force in their international relations. And then in Charter Article 33, it outlines some of the mechanisms for achieving security and resolving international conflicts peacefully, including through negotiation, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, resort to regional agencies, etc. So in the charter itself, it's actually there. It's got a non-violent order set in. The problem of course has been in lack of implementation of these obligations by countries, vested interests in keeping arms races and wars going, and the powerful influence of the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council who have subverted this process. But it doesn't mean it's all lost in the UN Charter. There are ways that these processes can actually be implemented. And I'll give a couple of examples from our area of the world to start with. And this is why I got very much involved in becoming active at the United Nations and in international law, because we in New Zealand found ways that we could use those parts of the UN in order to resolve some of the threats to our security and to our people. One of those was, you'll see here on the left, the Greenpeace boat, the Rainbow Warrior. This was a peace boat that was protesting against nuclear testing in the Pacific, and French secret agents blew up the boat, a case of state-sponsored terrorism. France was more powerful than us. And how did we manage to resolve this? Because we had a big dispute with France. They put a boycott on New Zealand when we caught 2 of their agents. We resolved it through the United Nations through mediation. And then another similar case, nuclear tests. Here you see on the right a test of a nuclear weapon off Mururoa in the South Pacific. These tests were spreading radiation throughout the Pacific. How did we get France to stop? One of the key things we did was we took 2 cases to the International Court of Justice against France. That's part of the UN system. And that put the legal pressure on France, so they've now stopped the nuclear testing. There are many other examples of using these mediation or adjudication from the UN. I'll just mention one more. Chad and Libya had 3 battles, 3 fights, 3 mini wars over their border over the course of 20 years. Then they took the case to the International Court of Justice, resolved it, and ended up having an agreement over the borders. So here is examples that can be used, even if the UN is not perfect because of the power of the Security Council, we can still use it for peaceful resolution of conflicts. And that's something we can take forward a little bit more. How can we do that? We need to elevate this opportunity that there is. And so this year is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Civil society are coming together to call on governments to support the good points of the UN and then improve the points that need to be improved. And part of that is to call on all countries in the world to accept the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice, to be able to give it more authority in resolving some of these international disputes. And if you want to get involved in this whole process of engaging in the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, there's the website down there, un2020.org. The next aspect I want to look at is nuclear abolition. And I give the example first in New Zealand. Now, we are now, our country is one of the nuclear champions in the world, but it wasn't always the case. When I was growing up in New Zealand, our country was one of the most pro-nuclear countries in the world. And our government was accepting nuclear weapons coming into our ports on nuclear submarines and on warships. And so we had to mount a campaign to reject this idea that nuclear deterrence was something which was providing security for us. We argued that it was making us a target, not protecting us. Also, that nuclear weapons are inhumane and illegal, and that there are better ways to achieve security than through nuclear weapons. But it also took non-violent direct action. So here we have some of us going out onto the water in boats, on surfboards and sailing ships and kayaks to symbolically protest and block the nuclear weapons coming in. We also were very active in our cities, and we took resolutions to declare them nuclear weapon-free zones. And that combination of actions led to a change in the politics of New Zealand into bringing in a nuclear-free government and nuclear-free law. And now that is set in stone, and our country is against nuclear weapons, and campaigns globally on that. So now I take us to global initiatives for nuclear disarmament. There are a range of different initiatives and organizations. One network that's trying to bring them together to highlight cooperation and the different initiatives is established in 2000. Over 2,000 organizations have joined, and it includes both the call for an international treaty negotiated by the nuclear armed states, so that they're part of it, to eliminate nuclear weapons, and then interim measures to move up towards that, such as establishing more nuclear weapon-free zones. We already have a number. Getting the nuclear armed states to agree on the non-use of nuclear weapons as a stepping stone towards their prohibition and elimination. And also promoting renewable energies to phase out nuclear energy, because if a country has a nuclear energy, if they have nuclear energy, then they have a technical capacity to use that to then make nuclear weapons. So this is a networking organization. There are various campaigns that are part of this, and the AGM is coming up on May 23rd. So campaigners are welcome to, and others are welcome to join the online video AGM. Now, I mentioned that one of the key drivers of the nuclear arms race is the corporations. That's $100 billion a year are being spent on nuclear weapons, and the corporations manufacturing those nuclear weapons are lobbying for more money. And how do we address that? They have a lot of political power. So there's a couple of ways. One is to have direct action against the nuclear weapons budgets in the nuclear armed states. So for example, in the US, there's something called the SANE Act, Smarter Approach to Nuclear Expenditure. Here is Senator Markey, who introduces it into the Senate, saying that the United States could drastically cut the amount of money it's spending on nuclear weapons, maybe not eliminate it totally until the US can negotiate with the rest of the world the elimination of nuclear weapons, but could then use billions of dollars on better things, on public health, on renewable energies, on jobs, on resilient economy. The problem is that it's very difficult for Senator Markey in the US, or for similar approaches by parliamentarians over in the United Kingdom or in France or other countries that have the nuclear weapons, to counter the lobbying power of the weapons corporations. So to help that, there's now a global campaign on nuclear weapons divestment. And that's where anyone can get involved. You don't have to live in a nuclear armed state to look at your investments, whether that's your bank account or whether you've got personal investments, or whether you're part of a religious organization, or whether your city has got investment funds, or your university, or even at federal government. You can look at investments and move your investment manager to stop investing in the 27 corporations that are manufacturing nuclear weapons. And also you can give some support to this idea of shifting the money from nuclear weapons to better things. It's not just the budgets, it's also the investments. If you're not investing in nuclear weapons corporations, you could invest that money in better things, in renewable energy. So here are what we call social media memes, where various people can give quotes. We can put a photo to the quote and then circulate it on Facebook and Twitter. You may recognize some of these people. Elegandi there has given a meme to support the Move the Nuclear Weapons Money campaign. They're not all pacifists. Here we have Commander Robert Forsyth, who's a former naval commander, who isn't actually against the military, but is against nuclear weapons now. And then we have down there, the Dr. Lars Palmer, who's at the forefront of dealing with COVID-19 pandemic, people who've been infected. And then over on the right, you may recognize that name, Akinyi Obama Manis. That's a niece of Barack Obama. This is just a few samples of the way we can promote these ideas through social media. And then engaging our parliamentarians is very important. Whether it's mayors or parliamentarians, they have important power to adopt legislation, to take debates, to have resolutions, appeals, to move divestment. And so that's where we've brought a large number of parliamentarians together in Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament to advance some of these issues, both in the national level, adopting resolutions and legislations in their own parliaments, and in interparliamentary bodies like the Interparliamentary Union and the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. And then I said I'd circle back from nuclear disarmament to the abolition of war, because I agree very much with Shankar Aiyar. It's going to be very difficult to eliminate nuclear weapons while countries are still resorting to the threat or use of force, because nuclear weapons are like the logical extension of deterrence, of using weapons to deter someone from attacking. So we need to look at how to resolve those conflicts without the threat or use of force. Here we can draw some examples of countries which have managed to do that. So Costa Rica, Panama, Kiribati, and Japan all have peace constitutions. They're not all perfect, but they give an example that you can have a constitutional commitment to resolving conflicts peacefully, and that can lead to some interesting results. So Costa Rica, for example, abolished their army. 1949. So when there was a small invasion of the island that they bordered with Nicaragua, they didn't have an army to repel Nicaragua. So what did they do? They took the case to the International Court of Justice, and they won the case, and Nicaragua had to withdraw from the island. So it's an example of using the International Court of Justice again. I've mentioned here the Pyeongchang Peace Forum, which was in Pyeongchang. That's where the 2018 Olympics, Winter Olympics, were held. And that's been highlighting the idea of the Olympic truce, and to continue the Olympic truce and to use sports in the Olympics to advance the idea of the elimination of war, and the use of not just government-to-government diplomacy, but civilian diplomacy and sports diplomacy. And finally, I'll just mention briefly the global ceasefire. You may have heard that the UN Secretary General called on March 23rd for a global ceasefire in order to help with dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, and instructed special envoys to assist with warring parties. Some have actually agreed to the ceasefire, others are still fighting. There has been a call for the UN Security Council to support this. I mentioned because we know the P5 and the Security Council are pretty much benefiting from the arms race, so they're not very supportive of the global ceasefire. But Publica, the Avas ceasefire petition, has got nearly 2.5 million signatories, and there's also a new petition arising called the Global Weapons Freeze, which is calling for a freeze on weapons trade and production, not just during the pandemic, but then to lead after the pandemic into a better world. So thank you for giving me the chance to relate a few of the initiatives that are happening at the global level and what people can do locally with their mayors, parliamentarians, or themselves to support these processes. And here are some of the key websites that you can go to for further information or to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyn. And to all 5 of the panelists, a great round of applause from all concerned. For some really rich material and a lot to think about. Raise their hand to add a word, and I'm going to get maybe 2 or 3 comments from the listening audience, if you will, viewing audience, that maybe can be fielded. And please direct your comments if you can to one of the panelists. Connor, can I ask you to recognize a couple of hands, maybe 3 hands for questions that can be directed to panelists, and then we'll get the responses, and then probably have to head for the wrap up not long after that.
This is directed to Alyn Ware. Alyn, at the end you said that the people overall want nonviolence and want to stop war, and so it is what's needed, I believe, is a people movement right now that can give the power to the powers that be. And so I'd like to ask you, if there was a movement right now that was ready to go right now, would you be interested? And the reason I ask is because there is a plan ready right now. I sent a letter to Mubarak. I hope you received it, Mubarak. And it says that the plan is ready right now. So Alyn, would you be interested?
Thank you so much. And yes, as you saw, there are a number of initiatives that are happening to move these things forward. And whatever the one that you've got, definitely we can put it into the process and see how many people can support and how it can link in with the other ones. I think building cooperation between the initiatives is very important. Thank you.
I just want to say that I was really impacted by the Children for Peace, because you know the future belongs to them, and yet we and I include me in there, in the older population, seem to refuse to let them in for their voices to be heard. And that was very inspiring to see that. And I wonder, here's the question, how does that manifest in the mission to end nuclear proliferation? I just wanted to tell you many thanks for the work that you're doing, and it's a beautiful thing that the young people have a say in the future, which is theirs, and they should rightfully have a say. And my question is not necessarily for you, but just for everyone, including myself, to wonder how does that spirit of having those who the future belongs to more be involved in the work that's being done to end nuclear weapons. Thank you.
I said thank you very much, and I think we should involve children in peace building.
I have a commentary for Rose and the young people. One of the things that we clearly need to do, and the Poor People's Campaign is one group that is doing it, is showing the interlocking nature and the interconnection of many of our injustices. And so when we're talking about nuclear disarmament and demilitarization, the biggest polluter right now to our climate change is the military. So one area that the youth are leading in is care of environment. So certainly anytime that we are raising up or supporting the youth in leading for care of environment, we also need to be making that connection that the military spending is the greatest polluter to the environment. So make those connections wherever we can. And also a plug for the Poor People's Campaign, which is having a national movement which is now going to be online June 20th, 2020. But go to their website and get educated about all the interlocking nature of the injustices.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. If any of our panelists have any commentary to provide additionally, otherwise I see a question in the chat to Alyn specifically from Helen Hunt. I noticed you did answer that, Alyn, in the chat, but just wanted to provide you with some additional remarks that you could maybe speak to the whole audience. What effect do you think the pandemic will have on nuclear weapons funding in the US Congress and support the SANE Act?
Yeah, thank you very much. The pandemic is having an impact on people's thinking about military expenditures. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing so many people have endorsed the Of Us appeal, nearly 2.5 million so far. And it's also stimulated a lot of conversation with articles in key magazines like Time Magazine and that. We would hope that that would then have an impact on not just the nuclear weapons budget, which is 100 billion per year, but the global military budget, which is 1.9 trillion per year. The problem we have, though, is that those who are making the money will not give that up easily. And so that's where we can't just expect that they will change, that we will need to be involved in the campaigns to shift the money from military and from nuclear weapons to better things. And that will require taking actions like divestment, working with our parliamentarians, regardless of whether we're in a nuclear armed state or a non-nuclear state, working with our parliamentarians so that they can feel more empowered to be able to take up these issues, because they will be challenged when they are starting to challenge the military and the nuclear weapons budgets. They will be challenged by the industry saying, well, what about jobs, you know, et cetera, we're providing, and all the arguments that they'll bring out to try and keep their financial interests. So it gives us an opportunity to act, and we may succeed, but we will have to act to do that.
Thank you very much, Alyn. I want to begin to draw to a close here because I want to acknowledge each of the panelists and their really valuable contributions and encourage us to, in addition to some of the questioners and their questions, you can see that there's plenty of ferment around nonviolent ways of approaching a whole array of social problems in the powerful world, in the powerless world. We can create people power and shift the dynamics. I wanted to quickly ask Martha to recap what's pending right in front of the Kings Bay Plowshares in terms of their dates of sentencing and what they're at risk for, so that people can remember to hold them up later this month. Quickly, Martha, please.
Yeah, we are not clear about whether our sentencing will happen remotely or in person on May 28th, 29th. We have been thrown with an additional burden of something called risk of death enhancement, which does not make us eligible for home confinement in the face of this COVID-19 pandemic in the prisons. So it doesn't look good, but we keep moving forward, and thank you for your prayers and support.
Thank you, Martha and Patrick, for your witness. Nonviolence International has been maintaining this series of webinars for several weeks now, and I know that there'll be plans in the future. I think they're a bit indefinite, but now that you've signed up for this webinar, you'll be invited to future endeavors as we continue to talk about a world where we are united in one movement for peace and justice in the world through nonviolent action and witness. I want to call on Nonviolence International founder Mubarak Awad for some final words to us this morning before we wrap up. Mubarak, are you with us?
I'm Mubarak Awad, a Palestinian peace activist, the founder and president of Nonviolence International in Washington, D.C. in the United States. Our hearts and thoughts and prayers with those who are suffering and who are in prison for nonviolence action. COVID-19 created very much of a trauma around the world, and we have to remember the families and those who left us, with many thanks for all the workers around the world that making our daily life better. I'd like to thank the Nonviolent International staff and volunteer, Michael Beer, David Hart, and all the interns, and especially Connor Paul, who make this webinar exciting and kept us all in line. Also, I want to thank Paul Magno for being our host, and a wealth of information from our speakers, Patrick and Martha and Alyn and Mammy and Divina. You are great. We appreciate every word you said, and you make us now think more of how we can deal with this issue. Divina, your Children for Peace idea is so great and so important, and I hope that we could hook that with children who are against a nuclear war. I also want to thank all the participants from different parts of the world. You are an advocate for nonviolence and peace. It is so nice to see many of you face to face. As we finish one more webinar, we are part of one another, and we are thinking of other issues. We really feel that we are getting the international community together. And that is great because Sheldon is so much interested in getting more people within this community. As we finish, we count on you to continue working for peace, each in his or her own way, so we'll have a better world. Free communities, And may God have wisdom for the leaders of the world to eliminate nuclear weapon. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mubarak, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning and bearing with some of our hardships and listening to the sharings. We're going to go forward from this point to make peace in the world, and together we will make peace. We will make a future for our human family and for our planet. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Namaste.
Stay.
David.
Love you.
Say goodbye
You
now.
all.
Native language. Wish you on your way for another great installment of When the
Hello,
World One of One
friends.
Another.
Much love to all of you. Thank you for all the information.
Everyone.
Thanks for all the great work.
Yeah, good to see all of you. Virtual touch.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Tashakur, tashakur.
Tashakur.
Mashukuru. Mashukuru.
Muchísimas gracias.
Bye. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.